Okay, so today I would like to talk about Joe Rogan and react to Kyle Kulinski again, and not only this particular video, but Kyle Kulinski's overall disappointment in Joe Rogan, which is evident on his channel, of course, it has been since Joe Rogan endorsed Trump and had him on his podcast. So I think this is a very interesting development, and the whole Joe Rogan phenomenon is interesting. So I would like to talk about that. And first of all, of course, Kyle is disappointed in Joe Rogan and has the right to be disappointed. He went on his show, I think 5 or 6 times, and there was a time when Joe Rogan seemed to be a cool guy, someone who's open, right, to many opinions, and someone who had many different guests on his show. He also had Bernie Sanders, he had Crystal and Kyle. He also had people like Cornel West, for instance. So there was a time, and I think this is very important, where he seemed to be open-minded, even perhaps leaning to the left, where he, from his own perspective, which is not some hardcore left-wing perspective, it's a more kind of a rational, neutral, I'm open to everything. So he had all of these different guests on, and you could agree with him, you could disagree with him, but you could say there was a moment in time where there was this openness to Joe Rogan and his show. Then all of that changed, and I think that's a very important phenomenon in regard to what podcasting is all about, what people who engage with podcasting, with political commentary, or generally just being on social media in these times, right? So Joe Rogan is someone who is one of the, if not the most popular podcaster, perhaps in the world. I don't know, maybe definitely in what he's doing, he's one of the most popular, generally very likable. You can listen to him, and his podcast can go for hours, which is nowadays not so unusual also. But for instance, for me, when I started watching and listening to his podcast, that was something definitely new for me. And then you have all these film stars and directors and musicians, a variety of people that just simply sit down and talk. So it reminds me a little bit of a show like Charlie Rose, where you have this very minimalist setting and Charlie Rose and his guests, and they talk, right? It all seems very relaxed, open, and sometimes candid. And people seem to also enjoy being on his show. They like to talk about stuff, to get into details and talk about their life and talk about their work and so on. So that was what was appealing for me, and I also think for many of his viewers. I generally don't have to agree with the political point of view of a podcaster, anyone who I watch on YouTube. For me, it needs to be interesting, and I need to get something out of it, right? Something interesting, something new, some new point of view maybe. There are people, of course, who are very problematic, who are almost you cannot listen to, like Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson, as a guest, and even more so as, let's call him a podcaster himself, some content creator himself. So it's very, very difficult to listen to them, to suffer through their arguments, and also, of course, the way they talk and so on. So with Joe, you had this very relaxed situation, people talking, and you could listen to it, right? Okay, so the question is, what happened to Joe? As I said in the beginning, Kyle Kulinski is very disappointed in Joe, and he thinks that what happened with him and Trump, that's a kind of a turning point or a breaking point or whatever. It's something that simply is not Joe Rogan that we know anymore. And of course, in this video, he talks about, in a way, criticizes Joe's disappointment maybe, or even angst a little bit, what's going on and why is this going on. And of course, Kyle's analysis is that people who voted for Trump got what they voted for. That's, in essence, that's it, right? So some of them are trying to distance themselves from Trump, to say, well, this is not what I voted for. All of that, for me at least, seems very, it might be, I don't know if it's disingenuous. It might be disingenuous, might be real, but the problem is that it's, in a way, when you look at it, it is somewhat false, because with Trump, it's like you really know what you're going to get. And all of these standard right-wing arguments, so for instance, the big subject matter, the big theme of Trump's presidency is, of course, immigration. And all you have to do as a right-winger is to say, yeah, we want to get rid of the criminals and all of that. And we all know that is simply ideology. That is the way they mask what they're really trying to do. And that is create a disturbance, right, in the society and blame everything on the migrants. And while at the same time, we all know that no society ever can sustain itself without migration, without migrants. Capitalism, first of all, cannot function without cheap workforce that they need, that people like Trump need, everyone who is a capitalist needs. But of course, part of the politics is this double talk, right? It's you blame the migrants, you talk against them, and Trump was exaggerating it excessively, of course, by talking about they're eating the cats, eating the dogs, or whatever. We all know that. But it is a standard right-wing ideology. It's you talk about migration, you know that you can reach people by talking about that subject matter in that way. It's very easy to blame migrants. And it's also very easy to say, well, the good ones are okay, but there are lots of bad ones. And in the end, we all know what happens. The good ones are the ones who get thrown out, who have problems, and so on. So it's not about the good ones, it's not about the bad ones. It's about creating this atmosphere of blaming migrants for everything, and which can create, psychologically also relief for many people who consider themselves not to be migrants, which in the United States is almost laughable to talk about that subject matter. One reason for me, I always admired about the US is that it is a migrant country. So what I never liked, for instance, in Europe is all of this right-wing talk about migrants and, small countries, people who like to keep to themselves. But in Europe, you can say, well, we have always been here. There's a group of people who can say, well, we are natives, right? We are, for instance, Germans or Austrians or whatever, French. And there are these people who come from the Balkans or come from Africa or come from Eastern Europe. And everything goes to shit. So what is clear is, from a left-wing perspective, is that capitalism, right-wingers who are capitalists by definition, need migration, but they also use it in the sense that ideologically. So they use it in the sense that they're constantly talking about them, putting them down, smearing, and so on. And at the same time, knowing that the system cannot function without migrants. And the effect of that ideology, the effect of that, all of that talk, is that simply the value of a migrant as a worker goes down. So you are by definition a precarious worker, whatever you do. So you have to always think about, are you going to throw me out? And this is precisely the situation the right-wingers have established, and the others, the liberals, and in the United States, the Democrats, and in Europe, the mainstream parties, center parties, and even center-left parties kind of also had to adopt that kind of a stance and not openly put themselves on the side of migrants. So the right wingers create this false narrative, and people who consider themselves, like Joe Rogan and others, Andrew Schultz and whoever, they consider themselves to be open-minded. They consider themselves, I'm not left, I'm not right, so I can look at this rationally. So rationally, when you look at it, or rationally in quotes, and when someone says, yeah, well, look at them, they're doing this or that, they're committing crimes and they're gangs and so on, you look at it from a perspective which has to accept that. So you have to accept that in a sense, because you're looking at, quote, objectively, because these are things that happen. Of course, crimes happen, and many of the arguments, many of the things that right-wingers use as an argument happen, right? But they use it as an argument in order to enforce their ideology, in order to come to power and to further exploit whom they can exploit. And at the same time, they have a perfect excuse. It's the migrants and it's the others who let the migrants in. So it's a completely false narrative, and people like Joe Rogan fell for that. And others, so that's only one topic, but there are also others like the economy, and of course the big subject of war, being anti-war. We all know it's no way that can function like that. That Trump is going to come in as an American president and suddenly end all wars. So we all know that that was one of Trump's scams, one of his lies. But many people, also some people who either were on the left or consider themselves to be some kind of leftists, even fell for that. So it is clear that an American president, whoever that is, and I would even go as so far to say that even someone as Bernie Sanders would have had problems to end the wars or not to continue certain wars. That would be very problematic. But Trump, someone who is always looking out for profits, who is always looking where he can profit, on whom he can profit from, and it's unimaginable that you can fall for that story. He's going to end wars, and of course he's still spouting that propaganda that he actually did end wars and so on. So this turns out to be what is wrong with Joe Rogan and others who think that they have a neutral and objective position. It's precisely these people who fall for this kind of propaganda instead of having firm beliefs. Now, of course, you can have firm beliefs on the right and so on, but still that's something that you can engage with. And if I know your views are such and such, then I know, and that's it. Sometimes you have to, if you criticize, you can get into conflict and so on. But this is precisely what's the problem with when you are a podcaster, right? If you are a podcaster like Joe Rogan and you try to interview everyone almost, right? Your show is such that you can imagine having everyone on your podcast, because that's the only way to produce so much. Right? He made more than 2,400 podcasts. That's 2,000 people on your show. You cannot be someone who has certain political and so on position and have so many people come on your show or engage with so many people. So it's precisely this openness that in the end turned out to be problematic. Also because podcasting and political commentary and commentary on the internet in general, it does function in a way that your stance is very important. Your personal views are very important. This is why you have channels like Kyle's channel, Breaking Points, The Vanguard, and many, many others where you know where they stand, right? Some channels, of course, change their position, and this is the other very interesting thing. I'll probably talk about in the next videos about TYT, the Young Turks with Cenk and Anna. But what I think that's special about being on YouTube, being a podcaster, being on social media in that way, is that you have a personal stance, that you have your worldview, and it's very important. That's how you engage with the world, right? Joe Rogan's approach was such that it almost reminds me of how mainstream media works, right? How journalism in that sphere works. So maybe he's not really different than Charlie Rose or shows like 60 Minutes, right? Where you have to have this openness in order to be able to talk to anyone. And what I also think is very telling is that almost everyone who comes to his show, he calls them their friend, buddy, and so on. You cannot have 2,000 friends, right? It just doesn't work. We also know that from Facebook, but we also know that from generally in life. So in the end, it came out that his true friends are people like Elon Musk and other characters, people like Ben Shapiro or whoever. So finally, he has shown his true face or his true character. That is his position, right? And now Joe Rogan has become a true YouTube podcaster, right? He chose his side. He openly endorsed Trump. This is also what Kyle talks in his video. He openly endorsed Trump. Trump went on his show. He didn't ask him any tough questions. So this is what's interesting for me with this Joe Rogan phenomenon, also as a media phenomenon and a political phenomenon, is that he functioned as a kind of a mainstream YouTuber, open and so on, and you could expect anything from him. But it turns out that, he did kind of support Bernie Sanders, but it also turns out that it was in the time when Bernie Sanders was kind of popular. It kind of seemed that he might be the next president. And now from this perspective, you could argue that Joe Rogan was kind of riding that wave, right? He was like, hey, maybe, I'm not saying that that's also conscious, that's necessarily conscious, right? He maybe did it unconsciously, who knows? But this is the situation you are in as a podcaster who wants audience, right? Who wants views and who is a kind of a quote unquote more commercial YouTuber who has millions of views on his videos. So he was perhaps riding that wave, hoping maybe if you're good with Bernie Sanders, then he becomes the president, and then that's good for you also. And then it turned out not to be so. So maybe Joe and others are simply acting like people who are in business, and they need to look out for where the wind's blowing, to see which way to turn to. So actually, I believe that happened with Trump, but I also think that this might be Joe Rogan's true self. That's who he is, right? That's Joe Rogan, who in the end, like many people who always argue that they're open, objective, neutral, rational, neither left nor right, turn out to be right-wingers.